warm welcome to everyone. I am Shrija Agrawal, and you are watching the special podcast series Makers FM that we are curating with Maker Bhavan Foundation. So, India is said to have the largest youth population in the world with close to 810 million people living under the age of 35. Now, that is close to 70% of nation's total population, and a lot of them are kids and teenagers who are brimming with full potential. But have we had enough of teaching them the information of yesterday with the tools of yesterday? Look at how fast the way everything is evolving around us, especially during the post COVID 19 pandemic. It's a post COVID world right now, so is it time that K 12 education takes a huge step forward as well with the implementation of academic makerspaces? And the question really is that can these makerspaces really equip students, even in the early stages of their education, with the skills to create, innovate, and most importantly, iterate and lead? Could it change the way how they see the world? Please help me welcome Aditya Vishwanath, co-founder of MakerGhat, to break it all down. Aditya, it is my sheer pleasure and privilege to have you on the Maker FM podcast. It is very, very exciting always to talk about students and children, those who are burning with this curiosity to change the world. I mean, all of us have been there. I want to understand from you, and especially this entire concept about community building, team building, all of these conversations that we've had off the record also, and that we've had till now on the Maker FM podcast. We spoke a lot about STEM education, changing engineering, but you really are at this amazing K 12 level. So, how do you take it further, the maker's mindset at the infancy level? Because what really is a maker mindset at that age? I don't necessarily think that the maker mindset can only come whilst you're doing your engineering. Maybe a maker mindset of an 18-year-old would be vastly different from, say, my daughter who is 10 years old. So, how is the maker mindset in that age?
Yeah, no, absolutely. First, thank you for having me here. Really wonderful to be a part of this and excited to have this conversation. See, I mean, there is this idea of what we call the kindergarten for somebody who first enters into school, where the whole definition of kindergarten is play. You are not really being told what to do in this space. There is some scaffolding, there is some nudging, there is some structure in place, but fundamentally the goal of kindergarten is for a young child to be able to have exposure to the world through very tactile experiences, by picking up blocks of Lego and assembling them and putting them together, by cutting through pieces of paper or cardboard and doing art and craft work or origami of different kinds of things, or using crayons and sketch pens, playing with clay, playing in sand, playing with each other in these spaces. That is the idea of what play-based learning looks like at the extreme early age. To me, that is making. Making, to me, the maker mindset to me is a foundational and fundamental skill of being able to use your hands to create. Creating without a goal, creating without any purpose, just creating for the sake of creating. There is a whole body of evidence from early childhood education research, from a number of other supporting fields, that suggest that one of the most powerful ways in which a young child learns and makes meaning of the world is, yes, through seeing, but also through touching, but also through constructing and destructing, making and breaking, and constantly going through that iterative process of failing and failing and failing again in a collaborative, open space, very much like what our kindergartens are supposed to be done. Now, kindergarten, just even the word kindergarten is a German concept and a German idea. But if you look at our Indian education system, historically, we had a very similar model of apprenticeship style education in small groups with a teacher, where students would spend extended periods of time engaging and playing and working with one another. Somewhere along the way, the older they get, we completely eliminate that form of learning and teaching. It is completely, almost entirely replaced by a textbook and a whiteboard or a blackboard, and somebody in the front who quite literally in most of our government schools, unfortunately, is literally dictating and reading from the book. Students are writing down what is being dictated, and that is considered learning. That is considered education. And even in a great scenario, there is a huge emphasis on information retrieval and memorization that then starts to take center stage from, I would say, grades 3 or 4 all the way until somebody is 18. And then again, when they start applying for engineering programs, we start criticizing students for lacking a critical thinking mindset, for not being college ready, for entering into colleges and struggling to find their way through, because all of a sudden we expect them to have the same critical thinking, collaborative, problem solving mindset that was probably there when they were 4 or 5 or 6 years of age, but then somewhere along the way was deprioritized by the system. By our goals of what success looks like in that 10 to 15 year window. So to me, the goal for maker education, for developing a maker mindset at the school level, is to primarily focus on making that kindergarten experience a complete school experience from standards 1 all the way till grade 12. And of course, what it looks like in grade 7, in grade 9, in grade 12 is not going to look like what it looked like in kindergarten, but the key building blocks of collaborative hands-on learning, one way or the other in spaces, regardless of what the material is. Maybe when you are younger, the material is cardboard, clay, paper, plastic, and Lego. And as you get older and older, the material gets more sophisticated, the material starts to diversify much more. But the same mindset of collaborative problem solving, of collaborative making exists. That to me is really the goal, the end game of all the work that I aspire to do, as well as the work that the maker movement at the school level tries to do, is to create those spaces where children can play, they can tinker, and they can fail, and they can fail again, and they can fail again without any consequence of failure.
Thanks for that, Aditya. And this entire concept of tinkering space. So you said something very, very interesting. The ability to create for the sake of creativity and not necessarily about proving something or achieving a goal. That is a very beautiful mindset to have, which especially students at that infant's age can have, especially from their infancy. But I want to understand from you that how do you invite creativity in that sense? Because the decision making process for that age is a lot governed by parents, not necessarily by students or children themselves. The maker mindset. Maybe the child can have a maker mindset. Do the parents share that mindset?
Sadly not, because they also went through education systems where that mindset was not celebrated. And also we have to recognize that the previous generation, the needs of what education had to do, say 20 or 25 or even 30 years ago, was to really, I mean, it was seen as an enabler for economic mobility for a large number of people, because what it did was it opened up access to jobs at a time when being able to be a very strong engineer that was really good at looking at a blueprint and executing on a blueprint, or being a very good doctor who was specialized and was trained in a very specific area of medicine, or being a very good lawyer, for instance, who was really good at reading the law and knowing how to practice the law, was very critical for the nation building efforts of the country at that point of time. I believe that as we enter into the next 50 years, this country is going to radically have to rethink what the future of jobs is going to look like. And all of a sudden, the moment we inspect that very closely, looking at how various technology trends are shaping the future of work, it will become increasingly evident to us that what we prioritized as skills 30 or 40 years ago is no longer going to be the case. I mean, pick the engineering example, since a lot of making and tinkering is centered in engineering and STEM use cases. That isn't necessarily true. Making to me is agnostic to field, but let's look at engineering because it is well understood so far. What was considered a successful engineer about 25 or 30 years ago is very different from what is considered a successful engineer today, because almost everything that our school education tests you on and that expects you to know can be done better by a machine. This was true about 100 years ago, when we started seeing machines replacing a lot of manual labor and manual work, and we had to upskill and retrain people to not work independently but work with machines. The same thing is happening in the digital space right now with software machines, with artificial intelligence coming in and completely eliminating the value of informational retrieval. Maybe 30 years ago, somebody who understood the specifics of, I'm taking a very rudimentary example, the specifics of the laws of physics, and was able to explain those to you, define them to you, and apply them in a basic way, was considered an expert. Today, all of that can be done 10 times faster, 10 times cheaper, 10 times more efficiently by a machine. So all of a sudden, is information retrieval as valuable? Is being able to perform differential equations using pen and paper as valuable? Or is it more valuable to be able to have a fair understanding of these fields and think very critically in an intersectional way, connecting diverse ideas and applying them in completely unique and new ways? There is a new focus on a new category of skills, and everybody's talking about this, right? The government has its own framework. They call it the 21st century skills. Globally, there's a lot of focus on these skills: critical thinking, agency, problem solving, growth mindset. There's a number of these buzzwords that are floating around for these skills, but it is increasingly no longer becoming a nice to have, but it is becoming a critical requirement. And so it is hard for a parent to let go of that, of what helped them succeed in their academic experience, and expect the same for the next generation. But the reality states that even if you go through 12 years of schooling and you end up as a school state board topper, that is absolutely no indication of whether you're going to succeed in the workforce, in a workforce where the jobs 10 years from today don't exist today. So somebody who is in school today is going to be in a job tomorrow that does not exist. That is the first time in history that we are experiencing that. And all of a sudden, thinking about how you prepare somebody for a job needs to be very radically redefined. And therefore, I think making as a mindset and hands-on learning, this divergent thinking, this problem-solving mindset has to take center stage, because that is what builds resilience. That is what builds somebody who is going to be able to succeed in that workplace of tomorrow. And these are all anecdotal experiences I'm giving you. There is a lot of even quantitative, large-scale evidence through global and national studies and reports that have been done that very clearly indicate that this is the biggest gap that we are experiencing or we will experience very soon as a society, given how many young people we have.
Thanks for that, Aditya. But how does one really get convinced about the jobs of tomorrow, which really remains an unknown entity altogether? For example, talk about our country, India, right? Since the advent of generative AI, even the low-cost coding jobs are gone. It's a huge threat right now. So the question really is not about how do I prove myself or my engineering marvel. It really is about survival. It's a survival mindset that we are talking about right now. Against that context, I have to ask you, do you think the time has come to perhaps flip the argument on its head and say that we should replace all computer science with AI and create more AI engineers and spend more time in that, because it's a trade off between survival and creativity that we are seeing right now?
For sure. And I think that is going to cause us more harm than good in the long term, especially in the present day context of the country. And you're right. It definitely comes from speaking from a place of privilege, thinking about what my career is going to look like 20 or 30 years from now, and doing work today that will reap benefits 2 or 3 decades later, when a counterpart fellow Indian citizen of mine from a economically weaker section of society only cares about whether they can bring food to the table tomorrow. That is all that matters right now at this point of time for them. The challenge is the same jobs that were considered stable even 5 years ago, these IT jobs, these back office jobs that you just recently talked about or described, those jobs are going to become obsolete. And so all of a sudden, what we consider employed labor is very quickly going to no longer be relevant. And so a whole generation of people, and the point and why this is important is because these aren't jobs that are going to disappear in 10 years. These are jobs that are disappearing right now. These are jobs that are being replaced in the next 12 months, in the next 24 months. Anybody who works in a call center, who does customer service and customer support, is already at risk of losing their job anytime in the next 12 to 24 months. And so somebody who has gone through 12 years plus 4 years of higher education, plus 2 years of training, which many of these companies offer. So almost 16 to 18 years of schooling, formal education, is not going to be able to hold a job for longer than 1 or 2 years. And so we're in a place right now where we have to think very radically. We have to think longitudinally. We have to think long term as a society. And coming to your point about how do you change somebody's mindset about it, you are absolutely right. That is the core of the kind of work that I aspire to do and that we are doing right now, because across the country, very few people actually need to be convinced of what I'm saying. At least the circles that are doing work in this space, the entrepreneurs who are working in this space, they all get this. Everybody has come to the same conclusion that I am talking to you about. In other words, if I had to rephrase your question, there isn't a supply problem here. Even the government has come to a recognition of this at the school level. We have an incredible program by the government called the Atal Tinkering Labs program and the Atal Innovation Mission, where there are these labs that have been installed and built since 2016. So there was foresight back then as well, almost 10 years ago, to develop these ATLs. There are 10,000 of them roughly across the country. Just yesterday or day before yesterday, with the finance budget, it was announced that another 50,000 Atal Tinkering Labs are going to be established in 50,000 schools across the country. So there is a huge emphasis in the supply side of things. MakerGhat, my organization, also develops and deploys programs and labs across the board. Supply is fine, and it will continue to grow. That will run its course. There is a huge demand generation problem though, and that is the side that we have to work on. How do you get every stakeholder in this space to demand this type of learning, to demand for this type of education? Exactly what you were describing and saying. How do I get the parent to call up the principal and to go to the parent teacher meeting and to tell the principal that I heard from my child that for 1 hour a week they do this makerspace activity where they go to the makerspace and they do and they learn something by collaborating and working with their peers, but for the rest of the week it's business as usual. It's the old stuff that's happening. Now my child only wants to go to school 1 day a week. They don't want to go to school other than Thursdays because they love what's happening on Thursdays. They're showing more joy, more excitement, more engagement. Attendance is higher on Thursdays. All of a sudden the parent is putting demand and putting pressure on the school, saying make this a recurring activity, make it from once a week to twice a week, from twice a week to thrice a week. Well, why should this be a period on the calendar? Why shouldn't every science and every maths class be like this, where my students work in a collaborative way? Why should science and maths be traditional memorization, ratta learning, and then this once a week we go and we do this fun thing? Learning should be this way. So that's the work that we are doing right now, just to kind of walk through the playbook of how we're operating. Our whole playbook is, let's start with once a week and let's see how this can generate demand. How does it generate demand from the teacher, from the parent, from the school infrastructure and the institution? And what are the short-term outcomes that can be delivered? So instead of confusing everybody, talking about critical thinking, talking about the future of work, talking about jobs, there have to be near-term goals that people are able to identify with. And so we focused on two. And I think a lot of people in the ecosystem are doing that. The first one is attendance. Our schools have a major attendance problem. There is a huge attrition problem, not among students, but even amongst teachers. And what we're able to show is that by introducing new forms of new pedagogies of hands-on learning in the classroom, teacher attendance spikes up, teacher dropouts rates fall, student attendance spikes up. Students want to go to school more. That immediately is seen as a huge win for schools across the board who are struggling. I mean, for the attendance and the attrition rates are almost as bad, if not worse, than what they were during COVID. And we don't have a pandemic-like situation, but people are not showing up to school right now because there is a loss in trust and a loss in faith in the system happening globally around the world. So that is number one, attendance. The second is test scores. It so happens, surprise, surprise, that if you learn the scientific concepts in a project-based way by building circuits and building models and developing an understanding by doing, or in biology, inspecting things under a microscope and learning to model data through a very collaborative hands-on process, it so happens you also do better on the board exam. It turns out that you are able to retain information better, you're able to articulate results better, and you do get better test scores, if that is the end benchmark of success as we have it today in the country. It so happens you will also get better test results than you would through memorization heavy and learning, and probably at a lower cost without having to go for additional tuitions, without having to go for additional tutoring support. So also reducing the cost factor on what a parent has to invest in their child to help them succeed and pass through the various barriers at 10th grade and at 12th grade. So to us, that is the short-term goal as an organization, is to make an argument for a school to demand a makerspace, to say that my school must have an academic makerspace, not because it's going to help with jobs in 5 years and not because it's going to help my students be more resilient tomorrow, but in the short term, it is improving attendance, it is reducing dropouts, and it is improving test scores and outcomes, which are the immediate, obvious, measurable parameters that every stakeholder today will agree upon that we have to have in place. Secretly, behind the scenes, we care about the long-term skill development. What we care about are building those foundational skills, and that recognition, that understanding is slowly evolving across the ecosystem. And this has happened around the world too. I mean, many other countries around the world about 10 years ago made it policy that every single public school at every level, primary, middle, or high, is going to have an academic makerspace. Every primary school in the US, for instance, will have a space where a student can go and they'll have access to Lego building blocks and a bunch of basic, not even Arduinos, but like Scratch programming based makeys and other microcontrollers to learn the very basics of logic and tangible bits and hands-on learning and blah blah blah. And then every middle school will have some sort of a robotics program, some sort of a drones program, some sort of an art and craft program that is all weaved in together as a collaborative makerspace. Every high school will have a pretty sophisticated makerspace. I'm talking about public schools across the globe, and to me that is the goal, is to create a grassroots movement where every school demands having a makerspace. Every parent calls up the school and says, why do you not have a makerspace? Why do you not have a hands-on learning program when everybody else in my city or in my town or my village has a tinkering lab or has a makerspace? That is the goal for us. Is supply side will get solved. The market will solve it. Demand generation is the key goal for us to unlock here. And we think a lot and spend a lot of time thinking about the different stakeholders here and what does it take for them to align incentives and then eventually generate the type of demand for this kind of learning.
Thanks for that, Aditya, and pointing it out very beautifully. So, two questions, of course. First is that education in India, anyways, given is very, very expensive, especially if I talk about the metro phenomenon. Even two people who are earning are finding it difficult in terms of just the education in the elite or the posh schools. That is one. And secondly, I want to understand from you that how do you make sure that this is not necessarily relegated to a very metro phenomenon? Because the real change can only happen when it comes to tier 3, tier 4. And in a country like ours, which is obsessed with marks and class 10th exams, do you have enough data or impact to say that students who come out of these maker spaces also perhaps perform better in their 10th standard exams? Because that really is the first litmus test, which perhaps a lot of parents have this thinking how you'll perform in life.
So there's many questions there and I'll try to answer all of them. So on the last thing you just said, yes, I mean, that's exactly what we do. Part of our metrics are, and what we're doing with the ecosystem is showing that a school with a makerspace is actually an academically better performing school than a school without a makerspace. And that's part of what we're doing for sure. But it's not just about the space itself. It's also about the mindset. A school with a culture and a mindset of hands-on learning, even without a makerspace, even without a physical space, with a classroom where the teacher is teaching not just by dictating, but not just by lecturing, but through having students collaborate and work in teams. Something as small as that can make a huge difference in terms of outcomes. And to us, we quantify our outcomes not correlating to the physical space, but correlating to the pedagogy of what is happening in the classroom. So that's one point of clarification. Going to the very first thing you said about how does this not become a city phenomenon and how does this go outside? The demographic you refer to in cities, the ones that are looking at international schools, looking at very high-end private schools, that is 1% of our young people in the country today. And I'm being probably generous as well with that number. Frankly, I mean, I don't even think about that demographic. Every data point I've given you so far, I assumed that we were not talking about that category of people at all. 100% of the work that I do is focused on government schools, and it is focused on government schools in urban, low-income India, in large cities, as well as in tier 2, tier 3 districts, villages, towns. We work in about a couple hundred tribal villages as well across a few states. So very different set of challenges, a very different set of questions to ask as well. And every, as you know, every district in India, every state in India has a different country of its own, with its own unique language, own unique historical and cultural background. The receptivity towards tinkering can be seen with a lot of stigma in certain places, can be seen with a lot of prejudice in certain places. So there's a lot of barriers at the social, economic, individual level that have to be broken. A lot of making, by the way, very often is seen as an activity for boys and not for girls. And that was a huge barrier that had to be addressed and continues to need to be addressed at every step. So there's a lot of systemic questions that need to be asked that will not even show up in an urban, wealthy, upper middle class context. And I don't worry about the demographic. They will figure it out. There are the resources and all of those things work, and they happen. Now, thinking about the demographic we are working with, are the makerspaces we have designed, the most affordable makerspaces we have designed, cost in terms of total capital expenditures upfront about 1,000 to 2,000 rupees for an entire school. And that is the key goal that we're trying to make an argument for over here, is making, and the mindset of making. And even a makerspace should have nothing to do with the materials at hand. And I mean that in a school context, at a higher education, academic context, in an engineering college, yes, materials matter. The space in terms of the tooling it has access to really, really matters. At the school level, at fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth standard, I'm at the middle school level, which is a big part of the work we do right now. There is a lot of research that has happened that suggests that the outcomes associated with making, the outcomes associated with building something, tinkering something, have little to nothing to do with the materials that were used. In other words, studies have shown that you can deliver the same learning outcomes with a makerspace program that just uses paper, clay, cardboard, sketch pens, and scissors, as would another makerspace program, an equivalent program that has a 3D printer and a laser cutter and a woodworking station and sophisticated robotics equipment and tools. And that is the key goal we're trying to promote here. Is this isn't about flashy gadgets that give an opportunity for somebody to do a photo op, cut a ribbon, and say, wow, we have fancy technology in our school or in our lab. That is not a makerspace. That is not making. To us, making is a mindset. It is a pedagogical approach for a teacher. It is a learning style or a learning process for a child, for a student. It is a mindset that can be delivered with very, very frugal resources. And that is the goal for us in terms of what we're trying to create. We have these $1.50 or 70, 80 rupees foldable microscopes that were designed by Dr. Manu Prakash at Stanford that we utilize for all our biology and life science programs and projects. For all effective purposes, it works as a sophisticated 5 lakh microscope. But for a village or a panchayat where we work in thousands of those right now, they can have dozens of those foldable microscopes versus barely being able to afford even a single electron or a sophisticated microscope. So for somebody until they are 15 or 16, previously they would have never even have seen a microscope other than in photos. Now they can actually use it, test it, implement it, and get all the foundational understanding of it, so that hopefully when they then go into higher education, they will see an actual industry grade microscope and they come in with practical experience versus just theoretical understandings. And that has been the biggest challenge, is how do we get practical experience in a low cost and affordable way, in a scalable way, such that every child gets to use their hands to play with it, to actually do it, to build a circuit using simple LED lights, simple sensors, simple actuators, simple microcontrollers, and to get the full understanding of the length and breadth of electricity and magnetism, such that when they go into higher education, now they can work with more sophisticated machines like oscilloscopes and voltmeters and all of that stuff, which are not affordable at the school level. But at this moment, because they're not affordable, people just show you photos of it and talk to you about it theoretically. But at least practically, could we introduce something that's in a very low cost way that can be delivered? So what I'm sharing, just to summarize all of it, is we have developed these different tiers of materials where you can have materials that are as low cost as 50 to 100 rupees to materials that can be as high end as what the Atal Tinkering Labs have of 20 lakhs or so. And it becomes very affordable then for a school to decide its own level of tolerance, right? How deeply do they want to invest in infrastructure while committing to the standards of the pedagogy and the learning. That is the goal. So for us, the real focus is on the training, on the pedagogy, on the implementation of the curriculum, on the teacher training, the classroom facilitation, regardless of materials. And if you're lucky, there will be materials. If you're in the average use case or context, the materials will be very basic. But the mindset is there. In fact, I would argue that some of the villages we work in, the mindset and the pedagogy of hands-on learning is much stronger than in most of the private schools we've gone to, which have sophisticated maker spaces, many of which are under lock and key, many of which you don't even know how to operate the laser cutter or the 3D printer. This is the reality in many private schools in urban cities in the country today, because the expertise doesn't exist, or there is fear that if it breaks, it's very expensive, so we won't use it. The filament for the 3D printer is very expensive. You're right, there are budget constraints. And so there were a lot of errors conducted where it was like short-sighted goals of big equipment, flashy equipment, large maker spaces without any real rigor around knowing how to use it, how to engage with it, how to work with it. in sustainable ways. So we take a very different approach. For us, material is the last thing we care about. We think a lot more about the pedagogy, the curriculum, the training, and the monitoring and evaluation of these spaces, followed by materials based on what budgets are feasible, what can be done, what can be supported. The other way to think about it, relevant to what you just shared, is making and a makerspace in a school does not necessarily have to be limited to the school. There is an argument to be made that every community needs a makerspace. And that's a big part of also what I hope to do. And I hope to kind of push forward as a movement alongside our work in schools. Think of makerspaces as the next evolution of what a public library was about 10 or 20 years ago. Every community had a public library. I used to go to local libraries in various cities I grew up in India. Whenever I wanted to use the internet back in the 90s and early 2000s, there were these public libraries evolved into internet cafes. So you would have access to computers to go online, and you'd have access to books. So if you needed to do archival work, research work, it was a meeting spot. You could meet people over there. It was a community resource for anybody who wanted to do some sort of innovative work, whatever that looked like. So maybe a makerspace can be that for a community. It is supported and funded and sustained by the community. Maybe there is a model for which you can have a makerspace as an open prototyping space, an open source center where you can open source not just the knowledge and the intellectual component of learning, but the physical prototyping and collaborative work. That's what a makerspace can aspire to be. What if every community had a 3D printer? So if I was a young person, a youth member, if I was 25, 20, 17 or 8 years of age, and I had an idea, I could go to this space and test my idea. I could rapidly print a small component or a part. I could go to the woodworking or soldering station and attach it together, or have access to experts who could support me in doing that. And I could immediately develop a prototype to test an idea that was in my head. That is how we can create a real grassroots movement of innovation in the country. And I think a big part of that is creating a model for community maker spaces that sustain, that don't just become rooms where dust is collected, where there is footfall of people coming in with the intent to want to produce something of value. That's hard to do, but I think that model does exist and can be done in a very successful way at the grassroots, especially in villages in India, where that culture of gathering in a space happens a lot.
Thanks for that, Aditya. Could you perhaps spend some more time talking really about that? What does your program really entail? Can you spend some time talking about that? We spoke about the material product depending on the budget of the school, tier 2, tier 3, and so on. So, what really does your curriculum entail?
No, yeah. So to clarify, I mean, I was using a lot of examples in STEM, and making is by all means not limited to STEM. The types of schools I'm also talking about are schools where they don't have science labs or they don't have any infrastructure for a lab. So you're right, a makerspace in the short term can be imagined as a lab. It is a great way to get at least buy-in. I don't care how you brand it. It can be a tinkering lab, a makerspace, a science lab. It doesn't matter to me. Ultimately, the goal is to create a space where you are working with each other and you are using your hands and not your heads. That is the goal for making, is to get children out of their heads, heads and into their hands. And that's really the goal for making. So if that involves you picking up test tubes and doing experiments, I would consider that making for sure. Making is the process of doing things with your hands and failing at it and testing it and building evidence by doing. But that can be extended beyond our traditional understanding of a science lab for sure. There is a lot, even in the world of, I would say, mechanics and physics, that very adjacently touches science, that we never even look at and never even experiment with at the school level, even in the science labs that maybe you and I went to in our respective schools growing up. And if you take it one step further, there is a lot in the realm of prototyping, and a lot in the realm of coming up with an idea, testing an idea, getting feedback in an idea, what you call the design thinking life cycle, of having a student go through that process of going from idea to conception to idea to implementation to prototype to feedback to iterating on that entire thing. That, to me, that arc is often not really visited at the school level. Even the science labs that we talk about, I think, lack the pedagogy that is required for making. It's very often a cookie cutter blueprint of do this, do this, do this, do this, and you will succeed. I think a science lab should be a space where a student can fail. They should fail in a safe, healthy condition. Of course, safety being a priority, as is in all maker spaces. But we don't celebrate failure as much. And I think a makerspace to me is something that is at the intersection of a science lab, an art and craft studio, and maybe a collaborative co-working space put all together, where you have materials of all kinds. You have, yes, scientific equipment, but you also have woodworking stations and soldering stations and art and craft stations and spaces and Lego and access to expertise, which is also very important in each of these different domain areas, where somebody can come and connect these different ideas together. I think there is a lot of siloing that happens in our schools as well right now, where it's science is science, social studies is social studies, and then the others are everything else, right? And that siloing also can be broken down in a makerspace. So to me, a makerspace is an evolution of a science lab. And for schools that don't have labs, it's a great way to leapfrog needing a lab and imagining a collaborative space where you can do science, but you can also do a number of other things as well, driving outcomes in very sustainable ways.
So your curriculum basically entails taking classes with teachers, training them, then taking it down to sort of students, right? So is it a 3 months program, a 6 months program? How intense is it?
So in our education system, the real power in determining and shaping education systems in the country is at the state level. There is a lot of power that states have with the state education mandate and the curriculum that they can implement. So we do a lot of our work at the states. We work very little at the center. Yes, there are central boards like the CBSE board, but there are very few schools in comparison to the state board focused government schools. So we do a lot of our work at the states, building a lot of capacity at the state level. So at the state level, the type of programs that we run are typically two or three. One is teacher training. So how do we actually shift a teacher's pedagogy from point A to point B? So they're one that is a teacher that isn't just, like I said, dictating from a book, but someone that is actually doing a collaborative activity. The second is curriculum itself. We look at the state education syllabus, which differs state to state, and map every single page of the textbook, the SCRT textbook, the science textbook, the maths textbook, the language textbook, to an activity. So there is an opportunity for this to happen, not just in a makerspace, but for it to happen in the traditional class itself, as an activity-based exercise. And then the third is actually allowing the state to run with this, right? So building a state resource unit at the state level and letting the state own it and implement it as a program. The states have a very extensive resource. There are block resource officers, there are diet officers across every single district whose job is to do teacher training, teachers capacity building, support at every single level. So we work within that mechanism, saying how do you activate that infrastructure, and how do you go from a policy mandate or a curriculum mandate or a framework to actual implementation at a systemic level at scale. So this is happening a lot in certain states really well, like Tamil Nadu, a little bit in a few districts of Odisha where we are working, and we want to use those as models to now extend to other states as well. And that is happening this year in many of these places. But a lot of our work is at the state level, followed by the district level, working with the district education officers and the district, if it's a Zilla Parishad entity, then the Zilla Parishad CEO and their office and their team. So it's really building capacity at those two levels that is often overlooked, that requires a good amount of work to happen, to create that mindset of what does it mean to enable a hands-on learning curriculum at scale across your classrooms.
Thanks, Aditya. That's a very meaningful conversation. We're talking about education and students and technology, and any conversation in that space cannot really be complete without talking about generative AI. There's a huge temptation globally, which is seen that students are more and more using ChatGPT even for their homework. There's a temptation to give that prompt, have your models printed, have the blueprint of your product printed, how you are thinking, get your essays, get your assignments, even get your maths test done. So when you have this kind of onslaught of generative AI, how do you sort of really imbibe that creativity into the minds of these young students who have this major temptation that I would rather use AI than really apply my brains? So how do you sort of imbibe that mindset that you have to use your brains as well as your hands to build things?
My hot take is I actually love what's happening with Gen AI in classrooms, because what it's doing is it is actually bringing the school system to its heels and to its knees. And who's bringing it to its knees is the students themselves. And I love that, right? If you are able to have a test completely solved for you by an AI tool today, then it's a bad test. I'm sorry. And we have to re-examine and ask a very fundamental question of what are we testing? to begin with, if the test can be gamed, if the test can be completely beaten by a student just using an AI tool to get all the work done for them. And that's the reality of the type of testing system and infrastructure we have in place. So I actually love what's happening, because now all of the stuff that we're talking about, that we've been talking about for decades, there are people who have been talking about the Tod, Ford, Jod mindset and work in the country for 20, 30, 40 years. Historically, in the 80s and 90s, there have been movements around saying hands-on learning needs to be the way we teach and learn. We have to get back away from the colonial era system that we have developed of schooling and build a schooling system that's focused on innovative grassroots problem solving. All of a sudden that becomes a critical lived reality. It's no longer a nice to have, it is no longer a pie in the sky dream, because of generative AI. And therefore, I would say the next 10 years is an excellent time to be doing this type of work. We need a lot more people to be coming into the space and doing this type of work: system building work, infrastructure building work, policy work, systemic change work, reforms in teacher training, reforms in curriculum, reforms in assessments at scale across the country. Because if we don't do this work in the next 10 years, these systems are going to collapse. They're completely going to collapse, because you're going to have a generation of young people who are going to game these systems, graduate with no skills whatsoever, without even the fundamental understanding of these ideas, because they have used tools to completely play the game of completing and gaming the system. And I love that for them. That actually shows critical thinking and problem solving mindsets in a young child, to know that they can use these tools in so and so way at a meta level, um, um, to be able to game these systems. So to me, I think with the advent of generative AI, now is the time for us to be doing some radical reform in our schools, because that's the only way this will work. I don't think band-aid incremental updates or band-aid solutions are going to work anymore. And as a young person as well, who is kind of dedicating their career towards this field of school reform in our country, I in my lifetime want to see this change happen, and it will take one generation to make it happen. With something like generative AI and it's in the mix, it could happen even faster.
I think you're bang on there. I think generative AI has kind of really shown the mirror to the education system.
Exactly, 100% it has highlighted the gaps, it has highlighted the massive challenges that have been articulated in many ways so far. And so hopefully this will be a wake up call for everybody in the system to really, and to be very, and to also be fair, it is happening, that people are creating and reacting to it in very innovative ways across the board, and therefore makes it very exciting for someone like me to be part of this space today.
So, what do you think of a company like, say, Byju's or an edtech which is aimed at large consumer markets, and perhaps do you think that they're really there with the intention of reimagining education?
Most tech companies are marketing companies today, and they're not really education companies, and they will also admit that. I think very few of them that are actually doing actual reform in teaching and learning, or actually scaling an educational product. And the marketing companies will, I mean, they will, based on what's trendy, they might do well or they might not. And the moment if a marketing company is honest about being a marketing company, they will do well. If a marketing company is going to sell you education under the guise of a marketing gimmick or a marketing strategy, that will fall flat eventually at some point, because they won't be able to deliver the outcomes that they are promising. And that is what probably happened with Byju's, I think, across the board. And there are many others in the market, especially in the Indian tech market, who will follow suit very soon.
Okay, Aditya, what do you think of models like Khan Academy, for instance?
I definitely am inspired by the model of free access to content, and free unrestricted access to resources. Khan Academy started as just a content shop and then evolved to becoming a shop where you could access curriculum, peers, assessment guides for various standardized exams around the world. Deeply inspired by that. It was translated to a dozen different languages. We need a lot more of that to go into the real grassroots of the country, looking at not just language translation, but even contextualization of content for Bharat, for a lot of for a lot of the underserved demographics of the country.
Thank you so much, Aditya. What an incredible conversation. And I just hope it opens the minds of people, especially our listeners and all those who are watching this podcast, on really how should you even think about education? How should you think about risk taking? What really is a school of tomorrow? The jobs of the future, and how we should think about building ourselves for a world in 2025 and beyond. So maybe the way we train our young ones today may be doing them more of a disservice from what I could understand was shining through from this conversation. Aditya, I have to ask you what really has been the most meaningful takeaway from this conversation for you today?
I mean, I appreciate that this platform exists. I think the opportunity to be able to share this work and to be part of a community of people who are talking about very similar questions is rare, and to my knowledge, we need to have a lot more of this. And so, the biggest takeaway from me from this event is gratitude that I could be a part of this platform, and that this might hopefully create a community and a space where more people can join and do this type of work.
Thank you, Aditya. It was my sheer pleasure and privilege to have you on this podcast. Until we see you again, goodbye and good luck. Thank you so much for joining us from the US.